Boba Fett, a name of such weight, importance, power, mystery, and prestige that with only 6 minutes and 32 seconds of screen time in Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, captured the imaginations of audiences worldwide and by popular demand had a consistent stream of appearances across all mediums for 41 years. The Mandalorian was a new chapter in Star Wars' illustrious mainstream media journey, with it being the first foray into live-action television, and the booming success of the show, its heritage, of course, being none other than Boba Fett himself, led to the original Mandalorian's grand return to the silver screen, in which he absolutely smashed any hindering expectations, reclaiming his armor all the while delivering an all-time kick-ass cameo. After the, admittedly, far superior reappearance of Luke Skywalker, we all were greeted to a cinematic closing shot of Boba's return to Jabba's palace, now staked claim by Bib Fortuna, in which he shoots the daimyo and takes the throne he himself once served. Chuck the body, bam, title card, Book of Boba Fett.
The stage was set for an epic game of conquest, and while information surrounding the premise of the series was kept under characteristically tight wraps per Disney standard, hopes were high among the fanbase at large. When the time finally came, however, reactions were worryingly mixed following the first spattering of episodes. What followed was a rapid quality whiplash roller coaster that left fans wondering after each episode, are we going to get a good one or a bad one this time? This trend continued to the bitter end, with each release seemingly holding the fate of the show's final reception in its hands. Now that the whole big picture is out there, the time has finally come to make a verdict on the quality of the Book of Boba Fett, which is precisely what Jack and I have set out to do. As our freshman entry into the world of television and movies, this is definitely a prototype video, but we thought hard about the way we'd cover it and decided on a classic segmented approach where we examine each facet of the show's design individually and at the end make a judgment based on the sum of our ratings of each element. It's not all too different from the way we run our boss rankings if you're familiar with those. At the end we'll show our personal ratings of each episode side by side, followed by our overall combined rating of the show. With that said, let us begin.
Narrative is a widespread, multi-layered term that covers all aspects of the plot, ranging from a canonical lore perspective to chronological storytelling. Needless to say, this is the most unorthodoxically structured series I've ever seen, with an uneven split between character-building flashbacks of Boba's slow rise from Tusken slave to Tusken raider, as well as inserted bits of modern-day exposition as daimyo of Tatooine. It feels as if the writers had a major misunderstanding of the sheer power of Jabba's position, read War of the Bounty Hunters for a canonical reference, and took it as the power vacuum left behind from his death being simply his estate and Mos Espa. By all means, his death, only a short year after the Grand Hutt Council's dissolvement, was catastrophic to the criminal underworld's composition, but simply put, the Book of Boba Fett's creative choice to host the entirety of Boba and Fennec's story not just on Tatooine, but specifically one city within the planet, created a stale environment the show only broke free from through the introduction of the Mandalorian. Pre-Din, however, the limited cast of characters and setting also meant a limited exposition, with the first half of the season serving more as background development for Boba over present-day power expansion as daimyo. Boba has both a literal and metaphorical dependence on the Bacta tank, with each fight sequence in the present day leading to a healing session, in which a generally continuous story of events pans out, beginning with Boba's escape from the Great Pit of Carkoon, to his saving of Fennec, up to his tribe's slaughter at what I believe to be the hands of Cad Bane. While on rewatch these flashbacks are enjoyable on their own, they were poorly communicated and above all forced in, somewhat shafting the current time period by pushing unnecessary fight sequences instead of syndicate workings and crime in general, and within said sequences mitigating Boba's power, then in turn injury, and a required Bacta session to follow. This created a dependence on Fennec and the mods to handle whomever, be it the Order of the Nightwind or Black Krrsantan, further pushing the narrative of Mary and Gary Suze, and on a more worrying note, an alarming lack of emotional attachment to characters as adversity is all but non-existent to those on the positive side of the moral compass. Since Revenge of the Sith, and debatably beginning with The Force Unleashed, Star Wars has had a massive issue with perfect characters who, due to their combat perfection, feel to the writers as if their present situation is enough for the viewer and a background isn't particularly necessary. Fennec and the mods, alongside the Bad Batch and I won't use a last name, rarely, if never, feature in near-death situations as they're too protected or rather too faultless to even get into such a scenario. This makes the story double as uninteresting, as most of the present is, as a matter of fact, run-ins with background antagonists, and in turn the rest of the episode up until Boba goes into the Bacta tank is predictable and slow due to repetitive narration. The overarching plot of Season 1 was Boba and Fennec attempting, and eventually succeeding, in recapturing Mos Espa from the Pike Syndicate, who had Mayor Mok Shaiz, Cad Bane, the Klatooinians, Aqualish, and Trandoshans on their payroll so as to keep running spice through the region. On a metaphorical level, this season was about breaking off from supposed destiny, Boba leaving behind his past as bounty hunter and son of Jango for a Godfather-esque crime boss personality, Grogu succumbing to attachment and leaving Luke's Jedi Order to rejoin the Mandalorian, and even the mods becoming hired enforcers over street thugs and cybernetic freaks. As inviting as new routes for character development are, in trend with Disney's long chain of lead protagonists, Boba went from cold-blooded villain to perfectly moral hero, and while admittedly I am biased to the darker side of Boba's complex, I welcomed this lighter version. However, due to his predictable sentiment, his character had little true growth outside of emotional inversion, and combined with the minimalistic build-up by way of Pikes paying off groups of people at a time, the show, when featuring its central narrative, never had significant pull by way of attraction. At the very end, we saw minor glimpses of the Boba of old, notably in his standoff with Cad Bane. However, as per usual, Fennec stepped in and kept his morality in check, preventing the optimal scenario with regards to entertainment yet again. Fennec still, and at the rate it's going, will forever be just a master assassin, powerful and loyal for the sake of being just that. Ming-Na Wen is fantastic and I have nothing against her, more so Fennec as a character is stale and brings down Boba's potential by serving as the generic consigliere. To keep the Italian mob analogy, the Capo Regime, in this case the mods, feel simply not from Star Wars, and once again are too perfect and poorly fleshed out to have any true meaning to the viewer. As I bring the Boba side of the Book of Boba Fett to a close, which is absolutely ridiculous to say, it'd be unfair for me to not point out the abundance of positives. The finale had some great moments, namely Boba and Din's side-by-side fall of Constantinople against hundreds of Pikes and Boba riding the Rancor, with another great moment being the minor slave 1-bit from Chapter 4, but above anything else, Cad Bane. In my opinion, his closing bit to end Chapter 6 was by far the best moment in the entire show. While his death was subpar, his murder of Mos Pelgo—
don't you mean Freetown?
My apologies. Freetown Marshal Cobb Vanth was essentially retconned through cybernetic modding. He delivered one of the best moments in Disney Star Wars, and for his short-lived return was the overarching villain this show desperately needed. However, without question, the peak of this first season came through its hiatus from the plot. With the recent break that Robert Rodriguez heavily cut the original filming and was apparently short of footage, the theory that chapters 5 and 6 were quite literally bits from The Mandalorian Season 3 cut and blended with bits from Boba might not be a theory after all. If only a testament to the quality of character Din Djarin is, he completely took over the season with only one episode, and all interest in Boba's story was immediately shifted to Din, Mandalore, and Grogu upon the opening minutes of his return. The Darksaber was a fresh take on action that had been slow and monotonous up to that point, and Din's journey to find Grogu, getting an N1 starfighter, going to the array from Halo to find the remnants of his old creed, and fighting Paz Vizsla for the saber was energetic well beyond what even Boba's greatest moments could come close to rivaling. Shamook's Luke Skywalker looked and sounded absolutely true to form, and if anything, chapters 5 and 6 are solidified proof that Mando is by far Disney's hottest character, with his short stint as lead being so good the finale was noticeably underwhelming relative to what it followed. With a convoluted, non-impactful, and generally forgettable exposition, the Book of Boba Fett's narrative so far has been unimpressive to say the least. With minimal redeeming qualities, but more importantly a lack of exciting premise, I give the narrative a final rating of miserable.
Cinematography is an integral but rather difficult to evaluate aspect of a film or TV series. To the casual viewer, it often glides by without notice unless it is particularly atrocious, and even among more finicky people, it's not totally set in stone what the label encompasses. Is it the beauty of the shots, or to examine it from a more utilitarian viewpoint, simply how effectively it conveys what's happening on screen? Perhaps originality plays a part? As with many things, the answer is somewhere in between all these. In the modern age of film, there is a lot of discussion regarding the extent to which the spirit of traditional cinematography remains present in the increasingly digitized process of filmmaking. I bring this up because Star Wars, which is essentially the poster child for science fiction, is a series that makes heavy use of such advancements to more convincingly portray the many exotic settings, characters, and technology within. While the Tatooine of yesteryear was gruelingly filmed in the deserts of Tunisia, it is now shot entirely in Los Angeles, using the stagecraft technology of Industrial Lights and Magic. For those of you unfamiliar with stagecraft, which I would assume is most everybody considering I was in the same camp until beginning research for this video, think of it as a giant green screen. It's not exactly the same, as it actually has the backgrounds in question displayed on it during filming rather than having them added during post-production. However, it is still a stationary, non-physical backdrop which actors perform in front of. This then begs the question, is there any cinematography? Should the definition as we know it be changed to accommodate this increasingly common practice? It's a fiercely debated subject of contention, but for the sake of the video I'm going to treat it as a separate but equally valid technique. They still have to take into account angles, lenses, and color choice among other things, which I think is enough to be considered legitimate even if framing becomes drastically easier. Anyways, to cut to the judgment and spare you the lecture, I would describe the Book of Boba Fett's cinematography as good if we are to use Jack and I's 7-level scale. There were no moments where I noticed anything glaringly wrong with it, and a few times, namely in the second episode, where I was actually impressed with it. This standout case became less surprising when I learned that this specific episode was shot by Dean Cundey, who was behind the camera for a great many famous works such as Jurassic Park and the first 3 Halloween movies and the Back to the Future trilogy. There's also a neat reference to Lawrence of Arabia's famous train scene buried in episode 2, which is something. Unfortunately, this is one of the last compliments you'll hear me give this show for the rest of the video. The lighting throughout had weird moments, for example the fight with Black Chrysanthemum in the 3rd episode. I found it was far too dark to be clear what was going on, and not in a cool way, just I stupidly listened to the instructions on a brightness setting menu in a video game way. For the sake of time, I'll be lumping in editing with cinematography, and I'm going to go on record as calling this one of the most confusingly edited pieces of media I have ever seen. This is more of a problem in the first 4 episodes, where the show is balancing Boba's present conquest of Tatooine with his past with the Tusken Raiders. The problem I found especially glaring, enough to lower my opinion of the second episode significantly, is how poorly communicated the flashbacks are. If you were anything like me, you thought the flashbacks were over after the first episode. Boba escapes the Sarlacc, gains the trust of the Tusken Raiders, and heads back to civilization. Dunzo. This was all they had to do, honestly. Instead, we were given a prolonged series of unneeded flashbacks detailing every time Boba scratched his nutsack in the last 5 years, cueing the viewer in on every detail you never needed or cared to know. So hopefully I am not alone in thinking that after that interaction with the twins in Mos Espa, Boba went back to his palace to chill in the Bacta tank or something, then go on a stroll out into the desert to clear his mind and catch up with his old friends, the Tusken Raiders. Obviously, if you're watching this as a repeat viewer, knowing the flashbacks aren't over, it's sort of obvious, but I will stand by it being valid to have been confused with the show's chronology as a first-timer. Although I am embarrassed to admit that I didn't catch on it was a flashback until literally like the last 10 minutes of the episode, so maybe I was being a bit dense. Otherwise, there isn't much else to report, but as a final overall ranking for the more technical aspects of the show's design, I give it a rating of alright.
Characters as a lone category is hard to describe accurately. Inherently, everyone in Star Wars, unless poorly acted or written, will be at least somewhat enjoyable. That being said, Star Wars has faced a modern renaissance of minimalistic character growth, namely through their heavy dependence on cameos from the Clone Wars, some of whose arcs were well finished years before Disney's acquisition of the IP in 2014. What I'm saying is that a character has to be shockingly bad for me to not enjoy them on screen. However, I hold their growth over time in terms of emotions and motivations just as, if not in a higher regard than the personality. Boba Fett had massive change right from the beginning, and that is a matter of fact. I'm not the biggest fan of him joining the human centipede of lawful good heroes found in Star Wars, but it is what it is, and I can't change that aspect of his character. With his character's upending, we were given the most inventive take on Boba over his 40-year existence in both Legends and Disney canon, beginning simply with his not being a helmeted, silent killer. Throughout the season, he showed glimpses of his past self, among other blips when taking down the Nikto Sand Riders. However, with help from Fennec, he strayed away from violence, only succumbing to rage with the death of his longtime enemy, Cad Bane. Fennec Shand is the pirate biscuit of characters as it stands, with generic one-liners and overpowered combat abilities to cover up the prominent issue of her having no internal depth. She's about as one-dimensional as you can write a character, with her sole purpose being to serve Boba and enforce respect. While it is doubtful, to say the least, that Star Wars will ever kill off her character, it only makes you wonder how much more different this entire show and Boba as a person would be without this direct connection. I think she's a great cameo persona, but less a lead. However, as a lead, she's decent but lacks the emotional gravitas you'd come to expect of such an important figure. But as if it was even a question, Din Djarin absolutely wipes all featuring characters in this show, with goals and motivations ranging from reconnecting with Grogu, serving Boba, and gaining back his creed's honor by visiting Mandalore, and potentially staking claim to the throne as Mandalore, rightful owner of the Darksaber. As we've said enough times to where a dog understands our point, his introduction was this show's saving grace, and with that, the internal complexities of his emotions and motivations changed the entire course of the overall plot, changing it from respectful transition of power to all-out war. There was a surprisingly large amount of both new and old characters reintroduced, all of which were brilliantly translated into live action. The twins were great for their short time on screen and provided a proper example of true power through money and credibility, and Madame Garsa Fwip was just so fun, bro. No, but she also had an equally enjoyable presence through grace, compassion, and knowledge of the system. Luke Skywalker, Ahsoka Tano, Freetown Marshal Cobb Vanth, Cad Bane, Black Krrsantan, Peli Motto, and R2 among many others made welcome appearances and stayed true to form, giving further life to the show. While it is a valid argument that Star Wars has become too heavy set on cameos as cushion for poor writing, and I'm not one to disagree with that statement, most felt necessary to push the narrative and provided much needed color to an otherwise bleak canvas. The Book of Boba Fett's wide variety of featuring personalities was both pulling, but in certain cases, flawed. Either way, it was by far one of these show's highlights and thus receives a rating of good.
There's no sugarcoating it, the production design for this show is lacking. They were doing alright for the first 2 episodes, but when the now infamous 3rd installment aired, all credibility that had been built up got tossed out the window with the mods. We've said it already, but I must reiterate how strange of a choice it was to add these random Cyberpunk 2077 looking characters into the dusty desert world of Tatooine. Every second they're on screen feels off to me, like I'm seeing Jeff Bezos in a Dollar General. They're just too sterile and non-Star Warsy to fit in cleanly. Jack brought this up earlier, and I also thought it was a bit odd that the show was, save for the amazing standout 5th and 6th episodes, entirely confined to a tiny area. They do realize that Jabba rules more than like 3 buildings, right? We see the General Desert, the Palace, the Bar, and the Mayor's House. That's it. Oh, and Mos Pelgo.
It's Freetown!
Oh, right. Sorry. My mistake. There were tons of cool possibilities they could have seized on, like seeing Nal Hutta in live action or some never-seen-before new planet that Jabba's reach had encompassed. The creative minds behind Star Wars have a giant boner for Tatooine, and it's definitely a cool world, but it's got so much time in the spotlight you'd think it was more galactically significant than Coruscant. It would be disingenuous of me to say it's all bad. The Pike Syndicate costumes transferred pretty well into live action, all things considered, and some returning things like Bomar Monks looked nice as well. Passable costume design is the expectation though, and as far as production design goes, this is nowhere near as good as, say, Dune, to use another recent desert-themed example. For the incredibly out-of-place mod gang and dull setting variety, the production design of the Book of Boba Fett gets a rating of miserable.
Out of all the categories in this review, action in a show about bounty hunters but Boba Fett of any was an absolute given. Until it wasn't. It's unfair criticism to say the action was slow because Ming-Na Wen and Temuera Morrison are close to and in their 60s respectively, because if you haven't seen The Mandalorian, clearly age isn't hindering anything in terms of movement or speed. The issue with the show's action comes in concept and choreography, something you'll notice is delicately taken care of in The Mandalorian while somewhat brushed off in Boba Fett. The problems were apparent even in the trailer. I remember reacting to it with Alex on FaceTime and pointing out how slow Boba's downward slam maneuver felt. And when the first episode came along, that spiteful claim became truth, with the street fight becoming one of the most illogical sequences in recent memory, that is until you realize it was made to be that way so Boba could re-enter the Bacta tank. This all comes full circle through the show's critical need for flashbacks, with the action being unfavorably centered around Fennec and the antagonist, with Boba usually being injured within the first few seconds of every encounter to set up another visit in the tank to heal. However, even though the entirety of the fights not related to Din were a mixture of hand-to-hand and blaster fire, when it was just Fennec it was exciting to say the least and did a great job filling in gaps that would otherwise be monotonous dialogue. I'm a huge fan of train hijacks, and I think this bit was brilliant. Perhaps a tad too long for my taste, but I did enjoy the combat itself as well as the overall scene. In both the train and all hand-to-hand combat sequences, there's clear roots to Maori tradition with Tusken gaffy sticks and demonic facial expressions, and in the show's most prominent hand-to-hand fight, Cad Bane's death, I know I'm not alone saying the death was exceptionally mediocre, however, for the minor blip that was the fight, it was incredibly inventive. But as the show's climax, the back-and-forth laser fire that continued for multiple minutes afterwards muddled down the impact of that death, not to mention the tedium of essentially trench warfare serving as the combat premise for the entire episode. The finale was almost entirely blank miss laser fire with a Pike death here and there, but a magical field around all protagonists when shot at, preventing the true feel of war from occurring. As well, Slave 1,
It's the fire spray.
the Firespray 31 class patrol and attack craft, was severely underutilized and is a core reason behind Chapter 4's rousing success, and in all truth I would have preferred it over the Rancor in the finale. No doubt the Rancor was neat and surprisingly accurate to the many fan arts created upon Boba claiming he wanted to ride it in Episode 3, however it was well prolonged and felt more like forced justification for Grogu being on Tatooine than its own segment. But what would be the action category without mentioning the speeder chase? I'm taking forensics right now, and we recently spent a unit on OJ, and Yeah. On the opposite end of the spectrum, Cad Bane's Western homage standoff with Cobb Vanth and the Deputy was the pinnacle of this show's action, and even among Eastwood films was up there with the best in the genre. Din and Boba side by side was one of the greatest stands in Star Wars, nearing perfection in terms of purely blaster fire. However, there was a noticeable lack of truly exciting combat that was so customary in Boba's return in Mandalorian, as well as The Mandalorian as a whole. With sometimes thrilling but generally average fight sequences, the Book of Boba Fett's action receives a rating of alright.
If narrative is the story, writing is how the story is conveyed. And if you thought I was harsh on the show in other categories, I'm sorry, but the trend just continues here. Once again, The Mandalorian is the show's saving grace, and runs laps around everyone else in virtually every category, writing included. Boba's change in character is, regardless of what you think of it, definitely intentional and done with the creator's knowledge. He was not accidentally written to be softer and more concerned with ethics. However, as I've seen many people ask, and for good reason, why? Is there suddenly a shortage of lawful good characters in the galaxy? I also don't get why the character disparity seems to occur between The Mandalorian Season 2 and The Book of Boba Fett, rather than between Episode 6 and The Mandalorian Season 2. Last time Boba appeared, he was definitely a changed man, but still recognizable as the character we all knew and loved, and that was supposedly after his big life-changing desert adventure. That glaring elephant in the room aside, I think the worst writing is found in the dialogue between Boba and his underlings, namely Fennec Shand and the Mods. Every interaction between Fennec and Boba is just something along the lines of Boba saying, "I should rule with respect. I'm gonna bake a cake for everyone in Mos Espa to show how nice I am, then they'll love me." And then Fennec replying, "Yeah, or they'll kill you. Stay sharp and watch your back." It's not quite good cop, bad cop, but Boba is uncharacteristically naive, and Fennec being presented as more experienced and wary is a really odd choice. As for the Mods, the girl in particular is a masterclass in how to make an annoying new character. Having her frequently correct Boba and tell him what to do comes off as both insolent and bossy, and neuters the main character. For example, that part in the last episode where she's like, "You can go run and hide in your palace. I'll protect the city." Like, yeah, good for you, whatever. Real passive-aggressive sounding. They're also just forgettable characters anyways. I couldn't tell you their names if you held a blaster to my head. I also thought that while he was a great show stealer when he did get screen time, Cad Bane was criminally underutilized and would have benefited greatly from being introduced earlier on. Luke was also utilized strangely. While it was awesome to see him back in action and the technology was frighteningly realistic, he doesn't actually contribute much to the overarching story. He's there for a few generic scene-before Jedi training scenes and then written out of the show. It makes the Mandalorian Season 2 finale sort of pointless, and that quote-unquote cliffhanger of whether or not Grogu would choose to stay with Luke or not was super obvious, since if he chose the lightsaber it'd have muddled the sequel continuity beyond recognition. I still liked the Luke bits, but they were a tad underwhelming and carried by the sheer excitement of a now rare Luke appearance. There is of course a middle ground, characters who are simply fine for what they had to do. The twins were pretty well done, and they had an imposing presence despite not being physically threatening, and you could definitely tell they held sway over things from the few appearances they had early on. I also found that they did a great job making a love-to-hate type character with the Major Domo, who reminds me of a certain family member of mine, which made it funnier to me. Very slimy, slippery person. We've been making jokes about it for the whole video, but I do want to address the whole Mos Pelgo being renamed as Freetown thing. Did this strike anyone else as a really odd and sort of comical decision? Jack and I both got a real kick out of it. People seemed genuinely despondent whenever it was called Mos Pelgo rather than Freetown, and the offender in question was always really apologetic afterwards. You'd think they just told them to off themselves or something the way they react. It's also just a really stupid on-the-nose name. It's like if I changed my name to Alex Awesome Guy and threw a fit whenever someone used my old last name. Lastly, what's the deal with the "I dated a Jawa" thing in episode 5? I love that episode to death, but that was one of the most awkward exchanges I've ever seen in all of Star Wars, or anything for that matter. It's pretty much admitting to bestiality out of nowhere. Imagine if you're talking to the guy fixing your car at an auto repair shop and he goes like, "Yep, looks like you need your brakes tuned up. Did I ever tell you I screwed a dog in the anus?" Love has no species, I guess. Amusing quirks aside, the writing is definitely not the worst I've seen, and is at least the funny kind of bad more often than not, which is definitely more palatable. With this in mind, I'm letting the Book of Boba Fett off a bit easy in the writing department with a rating of bad.
This show felt more as if it was a lore pit stop in its own entity, with it having few internal developments and more being a collective of setups for future narratives. Boba's post-ROTJ whereabouts now have a definitive timeline, and Tatooine in general, but mostly its criminal world had its lore holes plugged during the 5-year period between 4 to 9 ABY. However, we received very little by way of legitimately important lore over predictable facts, namely the 3-way split of Mos Espa under Bib Fortuna's rule, the death of Cad Bane, and Boba's reclaiming of said territory, with, once again, the majority of the show being spent piecing together Boba's journey from the brink of death and in the present Mandalorian Season 3. The twins' fight for Nal Hutta might become a novel, or comic, or perhaps even the basis for Boba Season 2 if that ever comes to fruition, but as is the case with the recent string of Star Wars productions, lore value from the shows only goes as far as hypothetical potential. The Book of Boba Fett gave us very little by way of inventive expansion, leading me to give the lore importance a rating of bad. It's fair to say this was one of Star Wars' most underwhelming productions to date, although with that, the odds of this being a one-season miniseries are so incredibly unlikely that perhaps on retrospect, with multiple seasons, a reignition of his anger and disposition for all who oppose him, and an established crime rule under his belt, the beginnings of Boba's return that were his first season on television may even be objectively regarded as enjoyable. I would like to say that if this wasn't set in the universe of Star Wars, this would be absolutely abysmal. However, it was, so our ratings in all categories got bumped up multiple spots from the simple nature of the Star Wars canon. As well, it's sad to see that creative differences among actors and producers were detrimental to the show's overall chemistry, not to mention its reliance on cameos and its overall failing of The Mandalorian Season 2 finale's importance. Even though I find it hard to believe there won't be further seasons, for the time being, this was it. To all except Dave Filoni, Jon Favreau, and the suits at Lucasfilm and Disney, the Book of Boba Fett has come to an abrupt end with dozens of loose strings and potential thrown in the bin, with yet another example of lackluster action, exposition, and writing in Star Wars taking the front seat as this show's lasting legacy. Nonetheless, I will admit that I did enjoy this season to an extent, and am extremely hopeful that we get more, as I believe this was, once again, meant to be more of a setup for the climax of The Mandalorian over an entirely unique spin-off, that is, until more seasons come around. However, with all categories, chapters, cameos, and unnecessary region name changes accounted for, Alex and I give the Book of Boba Fett an overall rating of bad.
Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. If you disagree or agree, please by all means sound off in the comments and let us know your thoughts. We feel that it's necessary to be as harsh as possible on specifically Star Wars because of how much it means to us as fans, so do note that while we were exceptionally critical, we both enjoyed watching for the most part, and truly hope it improves should there be future seasons. For the time being, however, it was at best subpar, and we feel that way definitively. Remember to like and subscribe if you haven't, and otherwise we're extremely excited to have begun our journey into the world of film and television alongside games as well. Once again, thanks so much for watching, and with that said, deuces.